We're all set.
All right. Good evening, everyone. Welcome to Finding the Source. I am Pete Carmichael at Gettysburg College, also director of the Civil War Institute, and with my assistant director of the Civil War Institute, Ashley Luskey. Good evening, Ashley. How are you?
I'm doing all right, Pete.
Well, tonight we have Amy Greenberg with us. Amy Greenberg is the George Winfrey Professor of History at PSU, and where I did my graduate studies. Unfortunately, Amy and I did not share the same time. I think you came probably 4 or 5 years after I left, so that was unfortunate. Amy added and bolstered a very strong, and continues to be a very, very strong department in 19th century American history. And there, Amy has been incredibly productive. She has published a number of books. I'm just going to mention a few of them. Most recently, a biography, and I'm going to give you the full title here, of a politically powerful First Lady. It's called Lady First, The World of the First Lady, Sarah Polk. And what I did not get, Amy, is who published this biography?
That would be Kenneth, Pete.
Kenneth published that as well. Now, the book that we're going to talk about tonight, Amy, I have to admit, I have not read it until this week. I've been, and there it is. Thank you. There it is. A Wicked War. I have it on my Kindle, which, of course, I'm sure many of the people watching this would be deeply offended that I read on my Kindle. I have it on my Kindle. So I've had to catch up on my reading here on the Mexican War. Amy, there's just so much on Netflix. It's hard at times to keep up with your reading, right? It's just
it really is. It really is.
I'm now into sports documentaries, and I love Last Chance U. The football ones they can be pretty brutal to watch, but the basketball one about a JUCO school in California is quite good. But I want to say this, Amy. This book is outstanding. And
thank you.
It's fantastic. Look, I think as scholars we're always lamenting, why don't people read what we write? Well, you know what? The three of us right here can tell you why. Because too many of us in our profession, we write prose that's just not accessible. And we forget the power of story. We forget about the importance of people. I'm telling you, this book does it all. I would call it, Amy, and you might disagree, I see it as microbiographies that you've been able to weave together. And we'll give Amy an opportunity to talk about this in just a moment. And she can talk about her cast of characters. But you get into the lives of these people, the writing is graceful, and you got the thumbs up from my wife. I'm writing a proposal for a book, and I said to Beth, read the introduction to this book. And she said, man, that is really well written. And it is. And the whole book is fantastic. It's quite an achievement. You've written many other books that I want to mention here as well. Manifest Manhood. I believe I signed that in our seminar. Did I not, Ashley, at WVU? I know I've assigned it to classes in the past when I taught graduate students.
You did not, but Brian did. That's where I first came across it.
That's okay. Yeah. And the book, I would like to take a look at it, is Amy's dissertation. It's called Cause for Alarm, the Volunteer Fire Department in the 19th Century City. That's your very first book. Is that correct,
Yes.
Amy?
Yes.
I wanted to ask you this before, and it's somewhat of a personal question. I'm curious. Are you related to Kenneth Greenberg, the noted scholar of Nat Turner? You've been asked this a million times.
I am not related to him. I met him when I was in grad school at Harvard, and he came and he gave a talk. And I went up to him and I said, my dad's name is Kenneth Greenberg. And he said, my daughter's name is Amy Greenberg. So we were astounded. Greenberg's not a very common name. So I thought that was pretty amazing. And he's a great historian, but no, we are not related at all.
We're not related. He is a fantastic historian, and his work on Nat Turner in particular, I think, is really quite good. Quite good. Well,
I love that book. I love the book on baseball.
Yes.
Baseball, lying. That's the book that taught me that one of the worst things that you could do to a Southern man was grab his nose.
Grab his nose. Yeah. That's right. I don't think that's the case anymore. I haven't seen much nose pulling when I'm down in the South. Greenberg did a fantastic documentary on Nat Turner called, I think, A Troublesome Property. a troublesome property. It's very well done. It's excellent. But tonight we're here to talk about your book and A Wicked War. And again, we'll have some questions from the audience, and we encourage them to type their questions in, and Ashley will then give them to us at the appropriate time. So, Amy, I'd like to start with just a really big, broad question. Why call the Mexican War a wicked war? We should note that this comes from Ulysses S. Grant, but you decided to use it as your title. Why?
Well, that's a great question. I think that the war was immoral. I'll just put my cards on the table. So I think it was an immoral war. I think the reason that people don't remember the war is because it was not fought for any principle. It was just fought out of land lust. So when I initially proposed to call it a wicked war, Knopf Random House was not in support of that title because they thought that it would alienate a good deal of the readership. But I just thought it was so great that Grant said it. So whenever anybody said, well, you know, you're saying that the war is wicked, I actually wouldn't use that word myself. And I can just point to Grant and say, look, here's a quote from Ulysses S. Grant. He says that it was the most wicked war ever fought by a stronger against a weaker nation. And if he had principle, the principle as a young man that he has an older man, that he would have resigned.
Yeah, that's powerful. I think the other thing that you point out that I had never thought of, and that is in Washington, D.C., on the mall area, there's a monument to every little battle, war, skirmish we've ever been involved in, except
the U.S.-Mexico War.
Right, except for that which is telling, I think, as well.
Yeah.
So I'm going to turn over to Ashley and let her get started here, and then we just sort of bounce back and forth.
So Amy, I'd like to follow up on your comment that not many people do remember or know a heck of a lot about the Mexican-American War. And I guess I'd like for you to just kind of orient our viewers into past scholarship or past interpretation of the Mexican-American War. When people do remember it or when they do talk about it, what are the terms in which they've traditionally couched that interpretation?
Well, that is a great question. Let me just start out by saying, you know, in support of this idea that the war is not well known, that I grew up in Southern California, and our textbook went from the Mission era of Spanish California to the Bear Flag Revolt, which was this kind of illicit uprising during the U.S.-Mexico War, to American California. And the war itself was never discussed. This was in California. We didn't learn about it. And my brother teaches elementary school in California to a largely Spanish-speaking group of kids, many of whom are undocumented. And he said hardly any of them know that California was once part of Mexico. So, okay, how did we get to this position? Well, the big problem, one of the big problems for the memory of the U.S.-Mexico War is that it was followed by the Civil War almost immediately afterwards. And the thing about the Civil War, as you guys obviously know, is that it swallows up everything in American history. Everything becomes a cause of the Civil War or the after effect of the Civil War or a hangover from the Civil War or the beginning of the long narrative of the Civil War. And to the extent that people in our generation or the generation right before us were introduced to the U.S.-Mexico War, it was largely through James McPherson's Battle Cry of Freedom. And in that, you know, magisterial work, beloved by so many, he starts out his narrative of where does the Civil War come from with the U.S.-Mexico War, and with the proposition, which is certainly undeniable, that conflict over the status of the territories gained by the United States through the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, the status of slavery over those territories was what led to the split between the North and South. So right there, the U.S.-Mexico War becomes a small beginning anecdote before the big story of the Civil War. Okay, so before McPherson wrote, what did people say? Right after the Civil War, the Republican Party, of course, took control of the government and remained in control for decades in the federal government. Now, the thing about the Republicans is that they were not fans of the US-Mexico War. And the main reason for that, I think, is because so many Republicans had previously been Whigs, or they saw Whigs as their forebears. And the Whig view of the US-Mexico War at the time, the Northern view largely, was that it was a war fought to extend slavery. That isn't actually totally true. This was how they understood it. It was what part of the slave powers' attempt to gain more slave states, to extend the power of the South. And so after the Civil War, all the Democrats who had been James K. Polk's party, the party that had supported the war, that had been in favor of the war, they're all out of power, so that the Republican view of things, including by our guy, Ulysses S. Grant, that's what people are saying. And this has like real life consequences for people who fought in the US-Mexico War. The veterans of the US-Mexico War cannot get pensions. Nobody will give them pensions because Congress says, well, look, if you fought in the US-Mexico War and then you fought for the Union Army, you can get a pension from the Union Army. If you fought in the US-Mexico War and then you fought for the Confederacy, we don't care about you. And if you were too old to fight for the, Union Army, like whatever, we just don't care. We've moved on. We have this other war to deal with. So people just stopped talking about the war. And I think, I've thought about this a lot. And I kind of think that the way that Americans want to remember the period before the Civil War in the late 19th century is they want to remember it as a peaceful period, like a period when basically the nation was at harmony, with the exception of the South getting more powerful. And this kind of weird, super violent invasion of a neighboring republic doesn't fit into that narrative well. And, you can look at images of Manifest Destiny from the period, and they're all very benign. They're all peaceful. There's nothing violent going on.
Absolutely.
So people just don't talk about the war. My most recent book that Pete mentioned, Lady First, about Sarah Polk. James K. Polk, the mastermind of the US-Mexico War, he dies 3 months after leaving office. And then Sarah Polk lives 50 years after that, trying to get people to appreciate the US-Mexico War and trying to get people to appreciate what a great man James K. Polk was for bringing all of this new territory, bringing half of Mexico's territory into the United States. And she just gets no traction with that at all. Now, it isn't until right around the First World War that a really important piece of scholarship about the US-Mexico War is published, and that's Justin Smith's History of the War with Mexico. And it's an amazing piece of research. He went all into primary sources, and it won the Pulitzer Prize at the time that it was published. And the book blames the war on Mexico. So it is an extremely nationalistic, American-centered view of the war that marshals some really impressive scholarship into original sources to claim that Mexico provoked the United States. It makes the argument that because Mexico was so weak and the US was so strong, that Mexico brought it on themselves, and paints the US-Mexico War as this huge victory. And that really influenced a lot of writing about the war up until really about the 1970s, which the 60s and 70s, the war with Vietnam got historians to start thinking about the US-Mexico War again. And the reason why is because it was another foreign war where there was a lot of domestic opposition to the war, the same way that the Vietnam War was. So some people wrote books about that, like what happened in the US-Mexico War, who opposed it, what were the goals? Both the US-Mexico War and the Vietnam War, the American public were lied to by the president, so people would get into that. And then after that kind of spate of examinations of the US-Mexico War as a kind of precursor to the Vietnam War, there were a number of very successful military histories of the US-Mexico War. most famously John Eisenhower's So Far From God, that got into all of the amazing military accomplishments of the US-Mexico War, really military-centered, not new military history either. We're talking like old, standard military history. And that's kind of where things were at before I wrote my book.
Yeah.
Amy, don't you think another way that the Civil War distorts our view of the Mexican War is that our insistence, at least the insistence among some, to see the Civil War as a brother's war. And then they look at the Mexican War and they forget that we're actually even fighting anyone. It was just this time in which the officers who would then spar against each other in the Civil War, they were buddies, right? They were comrades who formed these unyielding friendships that were unfortunately, severed in 1861. So I think for a lot of the people that I have spoken to over the years, especially at Parks, when they mention the Mexican War, it's kind of wistful, right? That's the last time we united as a people, and we were brothers in arms. And I think a lot of the fiction plays upon that as well. Take Killer Angels, and Killer Angels has a relationship, which certainly there was one between Hancock and Armistead, and I don't know if that is drawn back to Mexico, certainly drawn back to the old army. And then there's Pickett as well. And I just heard Tom Berenger, the actor of note who was in Gods and Generals, and I just caught just a whiff of an interview, and I'm almost certain he's wrong about this, but he was making the point about Pickett and Longstreet being together the first time, and that Pickett actually was Longstreet's superior, which that can't possibly be true. But nonetheless, the point being again is that we get very nostalgic about the Mexican War for just absolutely all the wrong reasons. Yeah. It is shocking again. We're able to extract the political causes and consequences of a war, and it suddenly just becomes almost like a sporting event. I have not read it. I've not read Eisenhower's book. As traditional military history goes, Amy, would you recommend that book?
It's definitely good. I will say Eisenhower, a lot of people drew on Justin Smith's book. They drew on the research in that, and he makes some use of that, but it's very good military history. Definitely a good military history. That wasn't what I wanted to do with my book, though. I felt, I teach the early American Republic, and I teach the Civil War here at Penn State, and I wanted a book about the US-Mexico War to be able to teach to my undergrads, and I'm not a military historian. I wasn't trained by a military historian. I was trained by Bill Gannap at Harvard, who's just a straight up political historian. Like he started out his Civil War class at Harvard by saying, I'm not a military historian. So just so you guys know that. And the military history, it just seemed like, well, that's fantastic that the bombardment of Veracruz was the first thing that the Marines ever did in terms of, invading from sea. But I don't care. Like, what I actually care about is the fact that a ton of civilians in Veracruz were killed with this bombardment happened, and that embedded journalists from US newspapers witnessed this and wrote about it back to the United States and gave Americans a picture of dead civilians in a city that had been bombed by the United States for the first time.
And Amy, before I ask my big question, I'm just giving you a little bit of pushback, and I'd say, I thought I'm going to teach military history for the first time next fall, and I always want to lead like I'm not really a military historian, but then I sort of pull back from that, and I would say the same thing about you. The book that you have produced, in many ways, reflects the very best of what military historians are trying to accomplish. And so those boundaries, I think, have come down, as they should have, a long time ago. And I just want to say, if you're interested in the military history of the Mexican War, read Amy's book. Hell, I thought it was fantastic in so many different ways. Amy, I'll stop boasting about or bragging about. Ashley gives this fantastic talk about one brigade, Iverson's brigade. And she gets the tactics down, but she situates that brigade in a cultural and social context, just like you do as well. And that's where we as a field need to stop saying, hey, we've got these boundaries. Man, those boundaries have come down. Some of us lean in a direction more than others. And Amy, you do gender as well as any I've seen when it comes to military history. So I don't want to define who you think you are as a historian, but I just want our readers to know, man, if you want to know military history about the war, read this book. It's good.
Thank you for that, Pete. I totally appreciate that. I will say that I needed the help from Carol Reardon to figure out what was actually happening in a couple of these battles, because I would read people's accounts of it and I just had no idea. So she was able to kind of walk me through the tactics, but no, obviously military history is totally different now than when John Eisenhower was writing his book in the 1980s. So there's a guy named Bruce Winders who wrote a book called Mr. Polk's Army, which is just about the common soldier, and that's a brilliant piece of work. So,
I need to take a look at that.
yeah, that's a really good book, and he gets into, you know, who are these guys and what are their experiences like, and why is everybody dying of you know, communicable diseases, and why are the regulars so much better trained than the volunteers?
I'll have to look at that book. Before I'm going to get to my big question, I just want to quickly note. So, as you might know, Carol Reardon is teaching here at Gettysburg College. She's teaching a range of Civil War classes. She's doing one on commanders next spring. And, you know, my students, we have great students here, but of course they have no idea it's Carol Reardon, right? They've got this noted military historian. I don't think certainly they appreciate her in class, but they have no idea about her reputation.
Well, I need to go down there and just say, hey,
you
first female president of the Society of Military History, right here. You know?
Absolutely, right here. Yeah,
she's amazing.
Yeah, she's wonderful to have. So, Amy, could you just give us a brief sort of overview? Your 5 cast of characters here, who they are, and then I thought that we might work through some of these individuals as a way for you to talk about some of the ideas and themes of your book.
I would love to. All right, so the title of my book is A Wicked War, Polk, Clay, Lincoln, and the 1846 U.S. invasion of Mexico. So our first 3 guys, they need no introduction. James K. Polk, Young Hickory as he's known, president during the U.S.-Mexico War. Henry Clay, maybe he needs an introduction. He ran for president 5 times and never got elected. I think he would have made a great president. He was the head of the Whig Party, a brilliant speaker. He moved people to tears when he spoke. And he was defeated by Polk, in 1844. And then Abraham Lincoln, who gave his first national speech about the U.S.-Mexico War when he was in Congress. So these are 3 of my characters. Another super important character is Nicholas Trist. And Nicholas Trist is largely unknown, which I think is really sad. Trist was the diplomat who traveled to Mexico and negotiated the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo. And he deserves a huge round of thanks for doing that. He brought a war to a close at a time when there was agitation in the United States to take all of Mexico as spoils of war, because the U.S. had occupied Mexico's capital, which is like, if that doesn't blow your mind as a concept, I don't know what does. The idea that because we were in control of the capital of Mexico, all of Mexico should become part of the United States. And then finally, John Hardin, who was this brilliant, super charismatic, beloved figure in Illinois politics, friend of Abraham Lincoln's, then kind of a frenemy of Abraham Lincoln's, but definitely the most powerful Whig in Illinois was not Abraham Lincoln, it was John Hardin. And John Hardin is the first in Illinois to volunteer. And he takes, leads a whole brigade of Illinois soldiers down to Mexico and dies there.
Yeah. Let's just start with Illinois and Hardin, and then we can kind of talk about Lincoln as well. So let's begin a war that, at least on the surface, popular war, I think one could say that. Certainly there were pockets of dissent from the very beginning, and that expanded or enlarged over time. But could you tell us, I think if I recall correctly, Illinois sent more troops to Mexico than any other northern state, and how that played in, because Hardin is a Whig, and so one would expect that he'd be somewhat reluctant to do this, but nonetheless, he's out there in the forefront. So tell us a little bit about the politics of that and how that reverberates back to Lincoln and his political future.
Wow. Well, so I didn't know a whole lot about Illinois before I started researching this book. And it was one of the great pleasures of researching this book was learning about Hardin and learning about Hardin's family. I won't give it away, but Hardin's daughter ends up being a major character in the book too. She's 13 when her father dies, and she ends up being a pretty important figure. So Illinois, we think about Illinois, we think, well, it's a free state, it's a northern state. It's a state that's formed out of the I'm blanking on the name of it.
The Northwest Ordinance.
Thank you. Yeah. So it's a state that's formed out of the Northwest Ordinance, and the Northwest Ordinance says that there can be no slavery north of the Ohio River. So it starts out as a free state. What I discovered in the course of doing this book is there's actually a ton of illegal slavery in Illinois going on at the time, including John Hardin has he has an enslaved person traveling with him. He travels as a slave, even though he's in Illinois. So Hardin is actually, he's a kind of aristocratic figure who, like Lincoln, is moving from Kentucky into Illinois. And he's just like, he's charismatic. He's really well educated. The thing that I kind of realized when I was writing this book is that it doesn't make a lot of sense to think about Illinois as a northern state in the context of the US-Mexico War. You really need to think about it as a western state, right? So there's this area in the West, and it includes Missouri, and it includes Kentucky, and it includes Illinois. And these are places where people have moved. They've moved west. And so there's a support and an appreciation of the idea of westward expansion that's really profound. Like almost nobody in Illinois in the 1830s was born there. Like it's made up of people who have moved there, and they've moved there for opportunity. And the US-Mexico War, when it starts, it is so exciting to Americans because a whole generation of young men, including Lincoln and including Hardin, were raised on stories of the depredation of the evil Mexican army during the Texas Revolution, right?
Right.
So in the Texas Revolution, as we all know, the men in the Alamo were all killed, and there's basically the Mexican army under the control of General Antonio Lopez de Santa Anna is renowned for its cruelty, and so there's Americans are kind of raised on this, and there's a very intense and widespread belief that Mexicans are cruel and they are immoral. And it's a racist discourse, obviously, but it's also discourse that's grounded in the white attempt to free Texas from Mexico, right?
That's right.
Texas Revolution. So when war starts against Mexico, there's a huge, tremendous outpouring of support. Way more men volunteer to fight than there's even room for. And John Hardin, who had been a member of Congress, he's the first Whig member of Congress from his district, a district that also includes Abraham Lincoln. He is in Congress, and the whole time that he's there, he's in support of the idea of going to war against Mexico. Like he wants it to happen. He's so excited for it. He makes it very clear that he is going to lead the troops when this happens. I should have mentioned both Hardin and Lincoln got their start fighting Indians in the Sauk and Fox War, right?
Yes, that's right.
So Hardin already has a military reputation. And then he has a further military reputation because he is put in charge of displacing the Mormons from Illinois during the Mormon War in Illinois. So Hardin has already got some military credibility. He's got some rank. And he's just gung-ho. He's gung-ho. And so he, you know, he's just on the front lines and takes off and is in support of it. What Hardin wants and what so many men from Illinois want is they want Mexico, they want Mexican land. They want to see an American Mexico. They want to see American farmers farming Mexican land, extracting Mexican gold and silver from the soil. They just see it as part of manifest destiny, that's part of America's destiny, is to continue what the Texans did in Texas and just take California.
So I have a follow-up question related to that. Of course, in Civil War scholarship and antebellum history, we refer to the Blundering Generation, or at least a group of historians once did, as, you know, they're the ones who caused the Civil War, that this was a completely, you know, preventable conflict between two societies that could have reconciled with each other, but it was, you know, politicians acting rashly, acting ignorantly, that led to the war. Given the statement that you could say that the Mexican War was fought for no reason, in that the Mexicans didn't, in fact, provoke the war. It was, you know, Polk who provoked. Can we say then that this was caused by a blundering generation, or is there more to it than that? Is that belief in manifest destiny that so many people shared, is that has more than a grain of truth in that's not just, you know, feeding into blundering, that there's actually a real legitimate purpose or dream there, at least that people thought at the time could be played out?
That's a great question. I've been thinking about this a lot because I'm writing an essay right now for the Mexican Department of Foreign Relations. They're doing a volume on important U.S. ambassadors to Mexico. So I've been writing one on Trist and thinking about this. And I went back to a book written in 1971 by David Pletcher, which is called The Diplomacy of Annexation. And that book really does argue, I mean, he doesn't use the phrase blundering generation, but that's 100% his argument. He says, if the US had known what they were doing, they could have gotten all this land without fighting a war. Without fighting a war. And then he details, I was reading through it just today, how inept the diplomats are. James K. Polk sends a guy named John Slidell down to Mexico in order to negotiate the sale of California at a time when the Mexican government is still upset that the US is claiming the area south of the Nueces River. So they are obsessed with a contested southern Texas boundary, and Polk sends a guy to talk about buying California. No understanding of the internal political situation in Mexico, which is very, very fragile, very fragile. And furthermore, everybody knows Slidell and hates him because he had said ridiculously racist things about Mexico in the past. Also, he didn't speak Spanish. So if you want to talk about blundering generation, you could say that's it. Now, okay, so some people have argued that, well, Polk did that on purpose. He sent an inept guy down to Mexico because he just wanted to incite a war. And I think before I started writing this book, I was very influenced by the argument that because Polk was a slave owner, he really just wanted to take a whole bunch of land from Mexico in order to spread slavery. But after really thinking about him and working on him for like 10 years, I think it's more the blundering argument has a little bit more merit. I think he had such a low opinion of Mexicans that he thought that they would just give up the land because the US was stronger. And then he thought when the war started that it would be very easily won because everybody knows Mexicans can't fight, because in his opinion, they were all lazy and they were. So from that standpoint, you could say, oh my God, totally blundering. And Pletcher is a great scholar. So I do buy that. But on the other hand, I have spent my entire career thinking about and writing about manifest destiny. And I believe that Americans, before the US-Mexico War and after the US-Mexico War, all the way up to the Civil War, they felt like the territorial boundaries of the country were not set. They were in limbo, and that we were marching towards something. And the whole history of the United States had pointed this out, right? That we start out as a few colonies on the eastern seaboard, Louisiana Purchase. It's just a series of land grabs that all work out for the United States.
Sure.
So I think Manifest Destiny is a very compelling reason for why this happened. I also kind of believe that Pletcher, I mean, I don't know, it's counterfactual history. Pletcher might be right that maybe the United States didn't have to fight this war in order to get Mexico to turn over these territories, because the country was broke.
Yeah.
Can we maybe even say, you say Blundering Generation, and Ashley's given us a nice summary of that school of thought and blaming it on the politicians. How about this? Why don't we blame it on the people? It seems to me that it's a dysfunction at the most basic level, or I should say grassroots level. And I'm embarrassed to say how little I really know about this period. I had no idea that John C. Calhoun opposed the war until the bitter end. And that he was far from alone. And here's my point, and then you can answer the pseudo question I have here. It seems to me that Calhoun capitulated as others did, because give the people what they want, which is, again, a thing that is so telling even about to this very day. That when our democracy sort of goes haywire, it's the damn politicians who are blundering, when, if you look closely at it, those damn politicians are often responding to the people who are going to get them in office or not into office. So
I don't know, Pete. This sounds like an indictment of the democratic process as it's currently operating. I don't know if you really want to go there.
Well, I'm an elitist from Indiana. You know, us Hoosiers, we are, we're not of the people. So
some of the worst snobs.
That's right. Just from Indiana. Yeah. I mean, what would you say about that? Is this not in the very end? Is not Polk and others? I mean, yes, they are.
Oh yeah.
Those desires, but man, it's the people who want the land, as you pointed it out.
Oh, absolutely. And you don't need any more proof of that than the election of 1844, right? So we have the front runner for the Democratic Party supposed to be Martin Van Buren. Everyone knows Martin Van Buren's going to be the candidate. And the front runner for the Whigs is Henry Clay. And, both of these guys issue a statement on the same day, which they claim they didn't write at the same time or after talking to each other, where they both say, I don't think that we should annex Texas. I think annexing Texas would be a terrible idea because Mexico doesn't believe that Texas is an independent country. And that, no treaty was ever signed that was legal between the two countries. And if we annex Texas, then it's just going to exacerbate sectional tension and result in war. And that is the exact reason why James K. Polk becomes the first dark horse candidate, is that the people are not okay with that. The people, the American people, the Democrats, and some Whigs like John Hardin, they're like, no, we are not only annexing Texas, we are taking more of Mexico. So you elitist politicians, you can say whatever you want, but we're going to throw you under the bus. And, the head of the Democratic Party, Andrew Jackson, back at the Hermitage, he hears about what Van Buren writes, and he's just like, yeah, Van Buren's over as a candidate. Right. We need a candidate who knows that the future of this nation is in expansion. It's an expansionist future.
How is it that as the course of the war progresses and the initial enthusiasm for it kind of drains based upon, the long occupations of Monterey and Matamoros and things, just, soldiers dying out of disease rather than in combat, nothing's, really happening. And people just get tired of that, especially when they start to see, the trains of diseased soldiers, pouring back into the United States. How does it come to be that this sizable anti-war movement occurs, which, because of Clay's direct playing into that and support of that ends his career? But Lincoln, who's kind of riding in on Clay's coattails and in many ways taking many points from him and reiterating much of what he says in 1848, is it correct? That's when he gave his congressional speech.
Yes.
That doesn't, seal his deal forever. He doesn't get, another term in Congress, but that doesn't completely, kill his political future. It definitely is something that hangs over him, as you nicely elaborate upon in your book. But how is it that it can kill Clay, the longtime, sweetheart for so many people, and yet it's kind of the political birth of Abraham Lincoln?
Well, Abraham Lincoln, he's at the right place at the right time. Like no better time to take a principled stand against the U.S.-Mexico War than right after the Whigs have won the House of Representatives, and right as the war is about to end, and then sectionalism coming out of what to do with all these new territories tears the country apart, and then you have the birth of the Republican Party, which is basically a direct rejection of the democratic status quo that had been in place from there. So I think Lincoln took a lot of flack when he gave that speech. A lot of people back in Illinois did not like it. It was not a popular speech. In terms of Clay, I mean, it is worth pointing out Clay was also literally dying at that point. So he had tuberculosis. He was dying. He was a changed man. One important story in the book is that Henry Clay's favorite son, his namesake, Henry Clay Jr., who's also a Whig, volunteers to go fight in the U.S.-Mexico War and gets killed. He gets killed at the same battle that John Hardin gets killed at. And this completely, this changes Henry Clay's life. Like, he went from being a man who showed no interest in religion to joining a church for the first time in his life. He joins a church. He does all of this introspection, trying to make sense of the death of his son in this stupid war, which he repeatedly says would not have happened if he had been president. And then he gives a speech opposing the war. And then that becomes the spark that lights up a nationwide anti-war movement. An anti-war movement that brings together people like John C. Calhoun, John C. Calhoun is not in support of the war because he doesn't like Mexicans. Like, he's not in support of the war because he says about the United States, this is a white man's country. And in his view, the people of Mexico are not white. So he does not want to integrate those people into the country. This is the basis of his objection to it. And then there's people all over the country. You've got the principled abolitionists. You've got basic opponents of war in general. But most of the people who oppose the war by 1848 are people who know someone who's died, or they've seen soldiers who came back from the war, and who see no end to what's happening. They just feel like the war is a disaster. They're reading in the newspaper reports of depredations against Mexican citizens, and it just needs to end.
So, I'm just real quick. I thought Calhoun also had objections to the war because he thought that Polk had violated his constitutional authority as well, right?
Oh, yes, he did. He did. Right.
I mean, he was also very upset about that as well. I just, and then I'll turn back over to Ashley real quickly. This issue of dissent, which is fascinating, that again is something that most Americans don't think about, that the Mexican War, that there were many citizens who thought that it was the wrong war. And so this issue of dissent, I want to tie to another point that you make, and one that I think you make in a very persuasive way, about the power of racial attitudes toward Native populations as well as to Mexicans, and that seems to be a driving force here. And I also like how you connect that racial ideology to this desire for land, which you said a little bit earlier. I find that too often, and even amongst our peers, that racial ideologies take a life of their own, and they start to have this controlling effect, which in some instances we certainly can see that. But when we start to disconnect ideology from the ground and from what people are doing and the desire for power, that racial ideology doesn't make as much sense to me. So you make this powerful, important case, and we see at the beginning of the war this degree of unity. How is it then that so many Americans come to express their dissent about the war? If their racial attitudes changed, or what does it tell us about racial attitudes? Are they more malleable? Are they bending? How should we understand race as an ideology when we think about why they wanted to go west and why some people pulled back?
It's a great question. So it's really complicated. And one of the things I was really surprised to see was the extent to which opposition to the war, a lot of it was grounded in racism. And it was grounded in a conviction that Mexicans were incompatible with American citizenship. And I think this marked a kind of dramatic shift from what had happened before with territorial annexation, which there's ongoing wars against Indians that revolve around or take as their impetus the idea that either you're going to exterminate the Indians or you're going to move them far away. There's also a lot of ideology going on at the time that talk about the power of United States birth rates to overwhelm whatever population we come in contact with. And the US-Mexico War, that a lot of soldiers just, they come to feel like the people of Mexico are not the kind of people that they want to have as fellow citizens. So it's especially when teaching, it's a kind of interesting thing to try and explore with students, is when how bad impulses can sometimes lead to good things, or good impulses can lead to bad things, right? How it's not as straightforward like the racist people are the bad people in this one, or the non-racist people are the good people in this one. Like, if your goal is to stop killing Mexican civilians for this war, then maybe the racist people are the people that you're on the side of, at least historically.
Well, I think what it shows too is that it becomes almost a barrier to understand people when we say they're racist, because everyone has racial ideas. And
Absolutely.
What you've demonstrated to us is the malleability of it and the flexibility of it, which I'll get on my little hobby horse here. I am so concerned that within our field now that racism becomes this all-encompassing explanation. And your book is it reminds me of Barbara Fields' important piece, Race as an Ideology. I think your book illustrates how these racial ideas are always changing, taking new shape, new form, and looking at how that articulation occurs. Man, that's the tough but complex and important stuff when we deal with race. And I think you did it really well.
Thank you.
Yeah, my question, I guess now comment, follows up on that, about ideas of race that people who were horrified by the atrocities committed against Mexican civilians weren't necessarily wanting to welcome them into the country and say, we want you to be Americans, that they could hold those two, it seems like to us, kind of polar opposite views in the same mind. They could still be, by our 21st century standards, racist, but they could be appalled by those atrocities, I guess, either out of a humanity's sake or just for the future of, what does this say about the U.S. military?
That's exactly right. That's exactly right. So if our young men, our white American men, are killing people in Mexico, even if we don't think that they're as good people as we are, that they're going to bring that back to the United States. That is going to pollute the United States. So yeah, and that's something Henry Clay talks about. A lot of people talk about that.
Right. Yeah, and of course, with the concerns that other nations around the world will take a look at the U.S. military and see, well, this is how they work with foreign populations, and this is their rules of war that they go by. I'm also curious, that leads me to my next question, about the dichotomy that or the conflict that arises between the regular troops and the volunteer soldiers. And during the Civil War, the emphasis of the citizen soldier and the volunteer soldier is so upheld. This is the epitome of American democracy at work on the battlefield. These soldiers would willingly sacrifice in a disinterested way for their country and for these high ideals. And we kind of see parts of that story playing out with the Mexican War too, and that these volunteers, had disdain for the regulars. They were kind of the poorer sort. A lot of them were immigrants. They were distrustful of soldiers who get paid to commit what they believe should be a patriotic service, out of the sacrifice or, your own ideals that you're going to war for, not for a paycheck. And yet at the same time, you have the regulars kind of looking at the volunteers and saying, well, you're not really qualified to fight these battles. And why should you be distrustful of us? We're getting a paycheck, but we know how to fight. So I was wondering if there are other political elements at play there between those two groups, if you could kind of unpack that aspect for us. Because again, admittedly, looking at that aspect of it through the Civil War historian's lens, that was something that stuck out to me as, the citizen soldier ideal, being upheld and being viewed, so highly in the Mexican War, but then also creating all of these deep conflicts and questions about what does it mean to be a truly patriotic soldier during this particular era.
I think if you want to understand what's going on with the volunteers, all you need to do is look at Zachary Taylor's dispatches during the war in the northern part of what was then Mexico, where he basically writes back to Polk and he says, you know what, if I could send the Arkansas volunteers home, I would. If I could send the Texas volunteers home, I would. These people are utterly unmanageable, and their officers who they elect are worthless, and they are doing nothing to help, and they are killing civilians, they are raping civilians, they are raiding farms and taking stuff without leave, and they basically think that they can go home whenever they want. So, like I said, this war starts with so much enthusiasm, and American men all over the country, they want to go down to Mexico. They want to have an adventure. They want to get some land. They want to get vengeance on Mexico. And they show up in Mexico, and guess what? There's no battles. You're stuck in camp. And because the volunteers don't know how to deal with basic sanitation, they all get really sick. And it is not fun. And the landscape is not appealing to them. It's not land that they can imagine farming. John Hardin repeatedly writes home and he says, he has such hopes for Mexico. And he says, there's not 1 in 100 acres here that a man in Illinois would pay taxes on. This land is worthless. And, he wants land. He wants fertile land. But we know, anybody who's been to Sonora or been to Chihuahua or Tamaulipas, this is not what they're dreaming of. What they're actually dreaming of, they don't know this, is the highlands around Mexico City. Like they want to be in Puebla. That's the appealing stuff. But that's not where these soldiers are for the first part of the war. So the political ramifications of this are huge because the politicians support the volunteers. The volunteers are their citizen soldiers. And the old army, to be a regular in the old army is one of the worst jobs you can have. It's one of the worst paid. And one thing you didn't mention, Ashley, is not just that you're getting paid to be a soldier, but you're getting beaten, right? You're getting whipped.
Absolutely.
You are subject to brutal and nasty physical punishments. And this doesn't jive with what white American men think that who they are or how they should be treated. It's too much like the way slaves are treated. So
right.
They have no respect for the regulars, but Taylor is clear that if he didn't have the regulars, he wouldn't win any battles.
Right. Right.
So it's a major conflict. And it is clearly true that the atrocities that are committed against civilians, it's the volunteers who are doing it. It's not the regulars because they're disciplined.
It blows my mind considering the massive revolution that occurs then in thinking about volunteer soldiers and the citizen soldier coming off of the, horrific Mexican War experience and the realities of what goes on, on the front lines with volunteer soldiers. And then they are lauded. They are the meat and potatoes of the armies during the Civil War. It's a huge shift, it seems like, which is fascinating.
So, Amy, I'm going to talk a little bit about the legacy of the Mexican War and your point that Americans either forgot, or you have someone like Ulysses S. Grant, who is very clear, a wicked war. And as a young man, if I had lived up to my principles, I would have resigned my commission. So I need to be careful how I frame this. But on the one hand, there is at best an embarrassment about the Mexican War that we just push it aside, right? There's certainly no one's ready to make an official apology about the war. But then Ashley makes this very good point about the racialization that comes out of the Mexican War, about indigenous people as well as Mexican people. So I think about that legacy, and now here's where I need to be careful, because I am not trying to ignore or deny westward expansion that continued into the late 19th century and the manifest destiny and the racial explanation for that. And I'm not trying to call for American exceptionalism. Now, here comes the punchline. Do you think there's any way that the Mexican War shaped America's attitudes in the late 19th century and into the early 20th century toward imperialism? When we think about what was happening across the globe, and we think of European powers that were carving up the globe in the world, all you have to do is go to the Congo, for example, which was one of the last places that was settled by Europeans, right? The U.S. didn't want anything to do with it. And you see that time and time again. And we do have, of course, the Spanish-American War, but let's be honest here. In comparison to what other European powers were doing, the U.S. stayed on the sidelines. And I would say that, is that not in part out of idealism, and maybe an idealism that maybe survived a little bit out of the Mexican War, that we said, hey, man, this was not who we are as a nation, as a people? Or am I just connecting too many dots here and trying to put a positive spin on something that just can't happen?
I don't know. It's a little, I don't really know. I don't know how to answer that. I mean, I think that there's this amnesia about the US-Mexico War. I think, if anything, Americans just forget that they even fought it. I wrote an article at one point about the congressional discussion to declare war in 1898. And how nobody mentioned the US-Mexico War, even though it was the 50th anniversary of the conclusion of the US-Mexico War. So I'm not sure. There's some diplomatic historians have done good work on how the United States was able to get everything that it needed out of commercial expansion after the Civil War, right? We were able to, basically do whatever we wanted in Latin America, like send the army down over and over and over again to intervene. Roosevelt's big stick policy. And there's a book that came out recently called How to Hide an Empire by Daniel Immerwahr that actually shows that the U.S. did continue gaining territory after the U.S.-Mexico War into the late 19th century and the early 20th century, and just nobody knows about it because it's like small islands all over the Pacific, and we just don't include all of that territorial expansion in our vision of what the United States is, because we're so, in Immerwahr's view, obsessed with the kind of map image of the United States. But he shows the U.S. just kept going on and gaining territory and then not giving any rights to the people of those lands.
It's How to Hide an Empire. That's
How to Hide an Empire. Daniel Immerwahr. Don't ask me to spell it. He's at Northwestern. He's at Northwestern. Just look up How to Hide an Empire.
We'll get it that way. Yeah. Ashley, did we have any questions at all from the audience tonight?
Yeah, there was one question about kind of the legacy about Mexican independence and how that played into Polk's decision to then go in and invade Mexico, and whether he was perhaps taking conscious advantage of that fact at this particular point in history that, they're especially weak now, they're, economically struggling, their political system is unstable. Was that a major deciding factor here, or was this kind of always in the back of the mind that, well, racially they're inferior and we could always go in at any time, but, I'm president now, so I'm going to do it. Is it because of the weakness caused by Mexican independence?
I think the weakness of Mexico was one of the precipitating factors for the U.S.-Mexico War. Now, Polk will never straight up say this, but when you read the way that he writes about power and the power that the United States has versus the power that Mexico has, it is very clear that he views international relations in the same way that as a slaveholder, he views slaves. So there's a weaker power and there's a stronger power, and the weaker power doesn't have recourse. Now, this is exactly one of the things that completely angers religious people in the United States at the start of the war. Like, a lot of religious people in the United States say, well, the Bible tells us that it's immoral to attack somebody who's weaker. Like that, we just know that, and everybody knows Mexico's weaker. The Mexican independence had such a devastating impact on the country. Had Mexico been stronger, when the U.S. has still gone to war? I don't think if Mexico had been really strong, no, I don't think so. I think this is why Polk thought it would be easy.
Right. Yeah. Amy, there is a book, I believe, that is published by Harvard. I don't know the title or the author, but it looks at the Mexican War from the Mexican perspective, right?
Oh, yeah, Peter Guardino's book. Yeah.
What's the title of that book? This is like comps, Amy.
The Dead March.
The Dead March.
The Dead March by Peter Guardino. It's a wonderful book.
The Dead March. All right.
Wonderful book. Guardino is a professor at University of Indiana, your home stomping ground.
Go Hoosiers.
Go Hoosiers. Guardino is a professor of Mexican history, and he decided to write this book on both the U.S. and Mexico in the war. Yes. It's a kind of monumental undertaking. It's a great book.
Yeah, fantastic.
Amy, I'm curious. We know that there aren't any monuments in the U.S. to the Mexican-American War. What is the situation in Mexico in terms of commemoration?
Lots of monuments, marvelous monuments. Mexico City has a totally fantastic monument to some young students who supposedly jumped out of Chapultepec Castle rather than be taken prisoner, the Niños Heroes. So they are the young hero boys. There are monuments all over Mexico. The awareness in Mexico of this war and commemoration of the war is like it's just much more. Well, there is no commemoration or memory of it here, and so just to say that there is some there. Yeah.
You know, Amy, I think I've got a brilliant idea for the Civil War Center at Penn State and for Civil War Institute that we can partner. Okay, ready? Here it is.
I'm ready.
We are going to do a tour of the Mexican War, but we're not going to do Taylor. We're going to do Scott. We're going to start in Mexico City, end at Veracruz, so we've got the beaches as our reward. Give you a chance out there to give some battlefield tours, right? We'll get you out there. We'll bring Carol Reardon along as well.
I'm going to sign up. Absolutely.
The beaches, that's going to be
sure that we don't end up in Veracruz during the summer, right? Unless we want to like replicate the everybody getting yellow fever and malaria in Veracruz.
You know, that's just the risk that we're going to have to take to enjoy the beaches and a good margarita. I think that's worth it. It's worth it.
I think there's nothing that makes more sense or is more appealing to me than the two most important Civil War centers joining forces in order to.
Yes, I mean you can't
do this tour of Mexico.
Yeah, what can you do? Civil War side, what's the reward at the end of the day, right? What, maybe some barbecue someplace, or you know, I don't have anything against that, but I think that looks pretty inviting. I think it'll do well. Amy, I want to say again that Wicked War, which I'll let Ashley show her copy. It is exactly what I think our field should always aspire to. This is argument. Themes, they're right there and they're there for the taking, but boy, you've got a great story there and great individuals, and it's so beautifully written, and it's hard for me to say that. I mean, my wife compliments someone else's work. I got a frail male ego here, right? I'm like, wait, well, be careful here, Beth, right? But it is so well written. And
I've got to say personally, Amy, that I think a sixth main character in your book is Sarah Polk, and I haven't read Lady First, but now I definitely want to, because I thought your treatment of her was fascinating, especially how you blended, notions of gender, of how she was able to, manipulate notions of 19th century gender in a way that was politically to her and James's benefit, but not threatening. I can't wait to read that book. So I think she's the honorary sixth main character in your book.
Well, maybe you guys will have me back and I can talk to you guys about Sarah Polk in Nashville during the Civil War, because she does some crazy stuff claiming that Polk Place is neutral during the Civil War. So she's...
Well, Amy, we've got you on tape now, because you certainly are going to get an invitation, which we should have done some time ago, to come to the Institute. We've unfortunately had to cancel it for the second year straight. But in 2022, we will definitely be live, and we would love for you to be there, because I know you're a dynamic teacher. And I just want to say, as a graduate of PSU, it is always comforting to know that professors there like Amy, they're doing a really great job of representing the institution. And Amy, we got to get some of our Gettysburg students up there to work with you in graduate school. I mean, again, take a look at this book, and I think you'll all be so pleased. All these different disciplines, right, coming together, and Amy does it so well and writes so gracefully. It's been such a pleasure to get to see you, to get to talk to you. We're eager to get you down here. We'll get Carol Reardon out and go have a few beers and walk around the battlefield some. It would be great.
That would be great. It's been such a pleasure. So nice to get to talk to you guys, and thank you for having me on.
Yeah, absolutely.
Thank you, Amy.
I always forget. I'm reminded of Polk. You had a great line about Polk. You said that Polk, he'd bring his cabinet and advisors together, and they would talk, and they would all get to a consensus, and then Polk would do just the opposite. And I thought, God, Ashley's going to read that, and she's going to start calling me Polk at CWI, because we decide these things, and then I go in the opposite direction. But really, what's the truth, Amy? We have just something that we sort of is our North Star at CWI. When the director, Pete Carmichael, says, hey, I think this is a good idea, my staff knows to go in the opposite direction, and everything turns out just fine. I rule by chaos theory, Amy. It works. It keeps everyone on edge, and it is continued state of bafflement and confusion.
That line did resonate with me, Pete. I have to say, I have to confess.
I was afraid you're going to see that. So, Ashley, who is Ken know next?
No, he is our final individual. It's actually Elizabeth Barron and William Kurtz from UVA about the Black Virginians in Blue project.
Good, fantastic. So we have Liz, and then we have Ken now. That's great. Amy, again, so wonderful to see you. Best of luck to the end of the semester. Stay healthy and happy, of course. And Ashley, Ashley and I see each other every day. I'll see you tomorrow as we have a conversation about something. Let me know whatever that is. I know I need to meet you, but I don't.
Very specific, yes.
Very specific, right? Yeah.
All right. Thank you, guys.
Take care, y'all. Have a nice evening.
Thank you, Amy. Bye-bye.